My Life in Our Times. And it outlines his life growing up in Sligo in the 60s and then becoming a local reporter at the Western Journal and taking up the post eventually of Northwest correspondent. That was actually back in 1980, and over the next 40 years he became a very familiar presence in our homes, on our TV screens every evening, and that was for his coverage not just from the Northwest but then from Europe and from the North. And along the way he interviewed all the major figures, really, the likes of Jerry Adams and Ian Paisley and Arlene Foster and of course Roy Keane. And as well, the book outlines how he coped with a cancer diagnosis that he got back in '94 and had to look about ways to access life-saving treatments. Well, delighted that Tommie's now on the line for a chat about the book. Tommie, how are you?
Lovely talking to you. I was chatting to one of your colleagues there as I was waiting, and I was telling her it's a blue sky down here in Sligo. So she was telling me it's not as rosy in Letterkenny. So I hope some of that sky makes its way up to you before the evening.
Well, it's far from blue here at the minute, and there's just a window in the room beyond here, and I can see the rain up against it and the grey sky beyond. But the new book, Tommie, Never Better, My Life in Our Times, and there's a picture of yourself smiling on the front. And at a time, I wasn't too sure if you would be, smiling at this stage of the game, because I saw that documentary that you did on a few years back about your battle with cancer, and it ended up being something of a campaign as opposed to just going in and getting your cancer treatment. It ended up being much more than that.
Yeah, I suppose the first thing about it is, in a way, it was kind of, this may sound like a strange thing to say, but in a way it was kind of liberating, because it brought home to me the reality that we're all just passing through, that none of us gets out of here alive, and that at some stage in the course of your journey you're going to be ambushed. I was in my late 30s at the time. It happened in 1994 when I was brought into hospital in Brussels for what I thought was an appendix operation, but it turned out to be a primary tumour with secondaries and then lots of spots, metastases on my liver. And one of the fascinating things about it, John, was I discovered that I couldn't get the kind of treatment that I needed in Ireland or indeed in Belgium. And there was a centre of excellence at that stage in Uppsala in Sweden. And I went back to my roots. I went back to the contacts I had in the Northwestern Health Board in our region. People like Donald O'Shea and Pat Harvey and Tom Daly were some of the executives I had known in the Northwestern Health Board. And because I was working in Brussels, I had learned of a Court of Justice decision that allowed you to access treatment in another country if it wasn't available in your home country. And the Northwestern Health Board, so far away from Dublin, from the centre of power, it actually signed off on one of those forms for me. And a consultant in Sligo General Hospital had the courage to say I couldn't get the treatment in my own country that I needed to stay alive. So that man, Peter Morrison, signed the form for me as well. And I became the first Irish patient to benefit from what's known as an E112. And of course, nowadays you have an extension of that scheme in so many ways, with the cross-border directive that has the Healy Rays sending busloads of people from Kerry and Cork up to Belfast to get cataracts removed. And you have people, and this is important for your listeners, that if there are people on public waiting lists and they're having delays for procedures, as a right, as a European citizen, they're entitled to go to another EU country to get that kind of treatment and paid for at Irish rates in those member states. And that's their right as a European citizen. And I'm alive today because of that particular measure.
Yeah, and this was back at a time when it wasn't known about, so you were breaking the mould, and luckily enough, it did all work out for you. But it's important that to this day that people are reminded that is available. And
yeah, John, and we formed our a patient support group for people with my disease. It's known as neuroendocrine tumours, or NETs. It's the disease that actually killed Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. And we had the 10th anniversary of our patients' organisation support group in Dublin last week. We now have a centre of excellence in St Vincent's Hospital in Dublin, where a lot of the procedures that I had to access abroad, they're now done in Ireland. But I was really interested that our patients group, that I met several people who had travelled down from Donegal. I met somebody there from Moville. I met somebody else from Letterkenny with their family members who had actually travelled down, who are now attending that patient support group. So it was good to see the way the services for people like me with my disease, with the disease I have, that they're able to access better quality care in Ireland through the Irish system.
Indeed. Well, that part of your life is dealt with in the book, as is early years growing up in Sligo and becoming a reporter with the Western Journal. And then your encounters with the great and the good down through the years, people in power, and your encounters with them and interviews with them. And in a way, I suppose, you'll be best remembered, Tommie, for an interview with a sports personality, not a world leader, not a politician or a prime minister or whatever, but instead a sports personality in Roy Keane. And even this week there was a documentary on, I think it was Monday or Tuesday, and it was outlined. We're going back over the whole Saipan saga again. Just tell us a wee bit about how, because everybody wanted to interview Roy Keane at the time. Nobody could get near him. He was out walking the dog, but you managed it.
Well, that's that's looking at it 20 years on. But actually, at the time, I was back in Belfast. I had been based in Brussels for 12 years, and I'd covered lots of football, including Champions League games with Manchester United during those years. And I had a bit of a relationship with Alex Ferguson because he had big links back to Ireland. He had friendship with Sean Fallon, who was a Sligo-born manager of Glasgow Celtic that Ferguson liked. Ferguson's brother at one stage had managed Waterford, and we used to joke about the time that he travelled to the showgrounds in Sligo as manager, and he had to drive the team bus back with the dynamo not working properly, and they needed a scout car in front. So you'd have those kind of exchanges on the margins of the Champions League matches with Ferguson. And in those games, I got to see Keane. So here I am in 20 years. Well, 20 years ago, I'm back. Around the time of Saipan, I was based in Belfast. And most of the sports journalists were on the other side of the world. And RTE needed somebody to go to try and track Keane when he was coming back to Manchester. And our colleague, Brian O'Connell, who was RTE's London correspondent, he was on holidays at the time. So they asked me, would I go to Belfast Airport and nip over to Manchester and see could I track him down. And when you say there was a big push to try and get an interview with him, as soon as he got back, the word was out that he was doing an interview with the Mail on Sunday. So I got in touch with his agent at the time, a wonderful man called Michael Kennedy, and I said, look, Michael, this isn't going to look right if Roy Keane wants to get a story across and he's getting across through an English newspaper. Like it's the Irish audience that he wants to talk to. So I made the case to him that RTE would, give him a primetime slot and we'd let him give his side of things. And Michael Kennedy, on that basis, persuaded Roy Keane that it would be the right thing to do to talk to RTE. I think he asked Eamon Dunphy, the journalist, about my work, and Dunphy said I'd be an honest broker, I'd give him a fair chance to tell his story, and that's how it happened. But I'd hate my life to be defined by, say, the Roy Keane story, because I had many, many happy times, in particular, say that 9-year phase when I was the Northwestern correspondent, and the first day I went to work as Northwestern correspondent was in an office on the Port Road in Letterkenny. Donald McLaughlin, the accountant, had an office building there, and RTE had a share of it taken. So I spent many's the day travelling the roads of the Northwest. I travelled every inch of Donegal, had great affection for Donegal, and I learned an awful lot of the knowledge about North-South relations and about the complexity of them and about the possibilities of them. I learned an awful lot of that during my 9 years as Northwestern correspondent before I went to Brussels and before I returned to Belfast. I loved my time in the Northwest.
In a way, you had a front row seat at some of the biggest stories of the time. And you're looking back now, you would have dealt with the major players, the prime ministers and the ministers and leaders and so on. In general, how did you find them, Tommie? Were they? I suppose we're all different. Was it generally, if you treated somebody with respect, and as you say there with Roy Keane, if you give them a fair hearing, they're more likely to be civil and accommodating.
Well, that's a lovely word you've used, being civil. You know yourself when you're involved at your grassroots level that it's always best to have manners. It actually serves your purpose much better if you actually try and give people the space to say what's on their mind. And say from everyone from Ian Paisley, living down south, I was terrified of Ian Paisley, the images I saw and the things that were being done, encouraged by him. I was terrified of him. But I found with him, and it was a lesson that was repeated over and over again. It was the same with Gerry Adams, the same with Martin McGuinness, the same with Arlene Foster, the same with Peter Robinson, the same with Jacques Delors, the same with British prime ministers over the years. If you try to find the human side of them, you'd learn a lot more. If you try to find what really concerned them, if you got a chance to understand their vulnerabilities, their fears, if you got a chance to have a sense of why they were doing things, that you could get an awful lot more out of them. Like Paisley was an absolutely perfect example of this. I found that it was the easiest thing to do, to have a row with Ian Paisley, because if you confronted him, he'd hit back, and then you'd say something else harsh back to him, and then he'd come at you again. And then it was just into a formulaic setting. And I found that if you try to create a bit of space to learn about where he was coming from, that suddenly things were different. And some of the most beautiful moments I had in journalism were those tender moments where you saw the human side of people. Like, say, for instance, I saw sides of serious Republicans, people who had an IRA passed when terrible things were done. And I saw in many cases that it was probably a pattern I saw repeated over and over again, that there was a basic decency in most people, and people were trying to do some good in the course of their lives, especially as they got older. And that was one of the ongoing themes of my working life. I also saw it, I covered many tragedies, and the dignity of people, the decency of people at a time of tragedy. You've seen it in recent weeks in your own community in Creeslough. I saw that during fishing disasters off the coast of Donegal. I saw it after bombings. I saw it when people were killed. While I was travelling around the country in recent times, John, I was down 2 weeks ago in Ennis in County Clare, and a woman came to a book signing. And 22 years ago actually, her son and two young lads from Banshire were killed. They were murdered over in the Netherlands. And I just remembered how vulnerable that woman was. Poor woman coming across to collect the remains of her son. And I just tried at the time to have manners in my dealings with her. And she came back 22 years later when I was signing a book to thank me. And that was the story in my life many times, that the ordinary decency of people, the basic decency of people, it was a recurring theme. And I think that's what's at the heart of the peace process that we have in Northern Ireland. And I think that's why the killing has stopped, that the decency got a chance to surface.
Well, your optimism comes out in this book, and I think also, as you've just been outlining there, your faith in humanity, and it's a great read. It's called Never Better: My Life in Our Times. Tommie Gorman, thank you very much, and the best luck with the book.
Thank you, John. If I could just say, I'll be in Four Masters in Donegal tomorrow at lunchtime, and I'll be in the bookshop there in the shopping centre in Letterkenny in the afternoon. And if anybody wants a book signed or anything like that, I'd be delighted to do so. And thanks for the space on your station. And I congratulate you, John, and your colleagues for how rooted it is in the community. All the best.
Thanks, Tommie. Just remind us once again, in the Four Masters tomorrow, at what time? Oh, he's gone. So we'll get those times and I'll remind you, but he's in the Four Masters and he's also here in Letterkenny then, one before the other, but both tomorrow, signing copies of his book, Never Better, My Life in Our Times.
Order. There's a lot to be said for it. Not the restrictive, always play by the book, straight down the line kind of order, but the order you place for a brand new 231 Audi. An order best placed having experienced true progress with a test drive